Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within the reach of a small elite. That's one of my favorite quotes from The Anti-Capitalist Mentality by Ludwig von Mises. Today we have someone from the Mises Institute, economist Robert Murphy. Mr. Murphy, how are you?
Great. How are you doing, Keith?
I'm doing terrific. Thanks so much for taking the time to discuss this horrendous book, The Conscience of a Liberal by Paul Krugman. Overall, what are your thoughts on the book?
So for background for your listeners and viewers, I actually, so Keith contacted me, I don't know, a couple months ago and saying, hey, do you want to come on the show to talk about Krugman's book? Since I, of course, have a podcast called Contra Krugman, and I admitted, I said, you know what, I'm happy to do that, but I actually haven't read the book. So he mailed me, the copy, and I thank you for that. And I actually got it while I was at the Mises Institute, so I was a little bit afraid to be looking at it with people. They might be skeptical. So my overall reaction is, obviously, I don't agree with the economics or the perspective he gives, and I know we're going to get into that, during the content here of the show, but I was glad to read it because it shed light on, so these essays are from a few years ago. And so I got a better sense of what Krugman's overall worldview was and how in particular he views the right, the movement conservatism, let's call it, he calls it that. And so it made a lot of his more recent columns more understandable to me when I saw him talk at greater length about what he thinks motivates these people and why he thinks race is so integral into what the right does. So anyway, it sort of filled in some of the pieces, and I think I have a mental model of Paul Krugman that's much more refined.
Awesome. All right, so let's start off with the introduction to the book, where he mainly talks about the causes of the 2008 crash. He cites reasons for the crash in that introduction. The reasons he cites are the highest inequality level since 1929, deregulation, and subprime lending. I think the great books on this I've read are Meltdown by Tom Woods and How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes by Peter Schiff. It's a cartoon book that basically explains the whole thing. What he doesn't say in this book is how deregulation, as a causal result of it, caused bankers to give subprime loans. He also doesn't say why these people in these institutions would make such stupid loans in the first place. Why would they do that if they're on the line? And he doesn't exactly say how inequality causes a crash. What are your thoughts on the introduction and the reasoning for the 2008 crash?
Yeah, so I agree. If your viewers haven't seen Tom Woods' book Meltdown, that's an absolute must. It's a great introduction to Austrian business cycle theory in terms of the broader, the abstract theory, but he also gets into real specifics about the housing boom and bust, and then even things like the Great Depression. And it's really amazing what Tom pulls off in that book. And it was a New York Times bestseller, right? So it's a very accessible page turner, believe it or not. So yeah, I would point people to that. You're right. So Krugman in the introduction doesn't really justify his claims. So you're right. For example, to say in and of itself, even if you hated commercial bankers and you thought they're just greedy and they don't care about poor people or broader social objectives, it's not clear why would they, left to their own devices, go ahead and just make a bunch of loans that are reckless. I mean, don't they want to keep their money, right? And that's like these phrases people would throw around. I don't know that Krugman necessarily would, but talking about predatory lending and things like that. It's like, these banks are just forcing people or tricking them into borrowing money from them when, ignoring or downplaying the fact that it was official government policy to get banks to give mortgages to people that otherwise wouldn't have qualified. And so my point on this stuff is just say, well, you got to be consistent here. Like you can't have people from the right, like George W. Bush, and to the left, like, Barney Frank and whatever, sitting there patting themselves on the back at press conferences, talking about, look at the Community Reinvestment Act and all these other things and how we're encouraging home lending. and then to be stunned later on and say, gee, why were these banks making such reckless loans? That doesn't make any sense. So I agree. Elsewhere in his work, Krugman does get into that. The quick answer is Krugman thinks, well, we can't just sit back and do nothing. So if a crisis happens, we need to come in and bail out the banks or rescue them, because otherwise the whole system goes down. And then the banks, now knowing that, are going to engage in more reckless behavior when times are good. And so that's why we got to regulate them on the front end, right? So that's the way he deals with it. He's saying, because we can't have pure laissez-faire. That would just be crazy. But even there, he's admitting the reason in his worldview that you need these regulations is because he's not willing to have laissez-faire.
Yeah, and we see something so similar today with college loans. Instead of everyone needs a house, everyone needs to go to college. So they're lowering the standards for who can go into college. Teachers can't fail half their class, so they lower their standards for what it means to pass. So college degrees are becoming more and more worthless, and people aren't going to be able to pay back these huge loans, especially when they're majoring in Lady Gaga dance study and all these other nonsense things. Do you see a crash coming with the college loan bubble?
Yeah, I do. And I haven't looked at that too carefully, but I'll say this, for those who really that's not been on your radar, I think you would be stunned to see how much of student debt in the United States the U.S. federal government owns. Like it's a staggering number. And so you're right that it's, the whole point of this, the reason the government has to be involved first, with the guarantee, like the subsidized and unsubsidized Stafford loans and all that stuff. And then now with them explicitly taking on so much of this debt where the government literally owns it. I mean, the whole reason for doing all that stuff is because they're saying, oh, absent such intervention or such policies, there would be inadequate lending. And, otherwise, students who otherwise would be able to go to college won't be able to afford it now because the banks won't give them lending, or private lenders won't give them the financing. So you're right. So these loans, by definition, are ones that someone in the private sector would not have made. That's the reason you need the government to be doing it. And so they're not good loans, and you need the government, the taxpayer, to be there as a backstop. So in general, I mean, part of what happened in the financial crisis and aftermath is some people who didn't have good job prospects, they would actually just go back to school, right? So it's sort of paradoxical, perhaps, that, when the economy's bad and you really want people to be working, they go into long-term training, and to wait for conditions to improve. And so with the, Fed's artificially low interest rates and all these other things at play, yes, to answer your question, I think there is a bubble in the student debt market. And that, as you say, as it's becoming more and more clear that colleges are overpriced, that they're charging ridiculous amounts of tuition to equip most of their, or let's say many of their graduates who can't go out and get a job to pay off those loans, that this model can't work, and it's going to be painful.
Yeah, it's also amazing that after 12 years of government education, people are so useless that they're like, without a degree, you're basically useless. You need to go to college. I've just been under you for 12 years. You didn't teach me anything? Come on.
Right.
All right, so let's get into chapter 1. He makes the assumption, like, it's so obvious I don't even need to cite my sources. World War II and the New Deal lifted tens of millions out of poverty. Is that true?
I mean, so I would say no. I can understand it a little bit better why he would think the New Deal did, just because at least they're prima facie, the government's giving, relief payments to people who are unemployed or to poor people or whatever. So you could say, well, they're at least they're giving money to poor people. Whereas the claim that going into a world war is going to help people out, I mean, that's just, so it's wrong on the face of it. And I don't know, do you want to get into that right now as to why that is such a crazy claim?
You know what? Yes, because I don't have it further.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right that he doesn't get into it later. Yeah. So I'll just be brief that it's the reason, just so your viewers understand, the reason the average economist might be tempted to say, yeah, World War II pulled the U.S. out of the Depression, or solved the Great Depression, is that if you look at some of the conventional statistics, it looks like it does, right? Unemployment was high, then the U.S. goes into World War II and unemployment drops. And think like GDP, real GDP figures were lackluster, and then all of a sudden the U.S. goes into World War II, and real GDP goes through the roof. But there's some problems there. So as far as the unemployment, and here I'm relying on the work of the economist Bob Higgs or Robert Higgs, what happened? The government drafted a bunch of people and then shipped them overseas. And it wasn't even like it was a one-for-one thing, right? The government sent way more men overseas to go get shot at and to shoot others than the unemployment rolls dropped. Okay, so in terms, just think about that. Like, you've got millions of unemployed people sitting there, and if you just take them and ship them overseas, and all of a sudden, but the unemployment actually didn't even go down by as much as them, right? So just showing you what a crazy method that is, and that's in no way solving the problem. And then as far as the GDP stuff, the big problem is that government expenditures count in GDP just as much as private expenditures. But yet, if the government spends $1 billion on tanks, that's not the same thing as consumers voluntarily spending $1 billion on radio sets. Okay, and I'm not being ideological. I'm saying just in terms of pure economic theory, those are different institutional structures. The government, taking tax money at force, and then the government officials, that's not really their money. They have to expend it on, public purposes. So everybody knows that, like, military budgets are vastly inflated, and, there's cost overruns and things like that. So even on its own terms, that's showing that those official statistics, if you look at just the component of GDP that's private, right? So the even on terms of their own numbers, the stuff that's just reserved for the private sector, that was lower in like 1943 and 1944 than it had been back in like 1933. Okay, so what I'm saying is the amount of output that went towards the private consumer side was worse in the midst of the World War II than it had been at the depths of the Great Depression. So that's just showing you the average person on the home front was poorer during World War II than they were during the Great Depression. It's just, hey, we're in a world war, and so people, they weren't just sitting around saying, geez, I wish I could get a job. Like, they felt like there's national purpose here. Oh, and the reason we don't have meat today is because there's a war on, and the reason my wife can't get stockings is because there's a war on, right? They weren't just blaming it on Herbert Hoover doesn't know how to run the economy. So again, even on its own terms, no, it's not true. Where you finally did have recovery was in 1946, when the government pulled back and slashed spending tremendously. That's when finally the private sector rebounded, and people actually had a standard of living that was higher than it had been before the Depression.
So he goes on in the rest of chapter 1 to say, race is at the heart of what has happened to the country I grew up in. The legacy of slavery, America's original sin, is the reason we're the only advanced economy that doesn't guarantee health care to our citizens. Why is he obsessing about this racial aspect of things?
Yeah, and so this is actually the key thing that I got out of this book that I didn't fully understand before. Because you're right, when especially under the Trump administration, Krugman just, no matter what, or even under the Obama administration, Krugman just kept going back to saying, oh, the reason all these Republican conservatives oppose Obamacare, when it comes down to it, is they don't want to give health insurance to those people. He would put it in in caps. And what he meant was, minorities. And I, at the time, I just thought that was crazy. What are you talking about? But in retrospect, so yeah, he, in this book, not just in the introduction, but some of these chapters going through, you're right. Krugman, he focuses a lot on how, the Republican political strategy of, trying to court the South. And because it's ironic on the face of it, that it was the Republican Party that was Abraham Lincoln. And so then, the South used to be all Democrats, and they were Jim Crow and everything. And then somehow in the 20th century, that transition was made. And so Krugman talks about that. So to answer your question, that's the long tradition, and that's where he's coming from. And so in that spirit, then that's why now Krugman, when he looks at even modern political debates, and to me, people who are completely sincere and just saying, well, no, I don't trust the government. I think the reason healthcare is so screwed up is because of government intervention. Why would we want the Affordable Care Act? And Krugman, aha, see, you actually hate black people. So, so to answer your question, yeah, I think he's totally wrong, but I at least appreciate now more where he's coming from, because he is, looking at today's events in terms of, the whole context of, U.S. history going way back. And yeah, obviously, the further back you go, the more race was explicitly involved in U.S. politics.
And I think it really fits the title of the book, The Conscience of a Liberal, because we see so many leftist progressives, they always assume race first. Even if you're just literally saying, hey, I saw the VA scandal, government can't help like 2% of people in healthcare, I don't want that for the rest of us. Oh, racist, obviously you're racist. So this is really just attacking the motives, so you can't really debate the topics. In chapter 2, he says, past inequality is due to a lack of social programs, and says the middle-class societies don't emerge automatically. They have to be created through political action. It took FDR and New Deal to bring society into being. Is government intervention necessary for a middle class to exist?
No, absolutely not. And yeah, this is the kind of stuff, and I don't know if we'll get into specific quotes as we go through this, but yeah, here in these chapters, this one, the next one, where Krugman is just matter-of-factly talking about how, the confiscatory income tax rates, sometimes above 90% at certain points in U.S. history here, and just how, yeah, that's, you need that because we got to take money away from rich people and give it to other people, and just like literally not even a single sentence saying, now, some people might think it's their property and we're not allowed to take it from unless we have a good reason. He doesn't even, no, it's just, so yeah, the title, The Conscience of a Liberal, it is, yeah, in Krugman's worldview, like, yeah, he gets to sleep, goes to sleep at night, not at all concerned about just taking people's money, for things that just say, oh, because I believe in redistribution, or, I would rather live in a world where there's a smaller gap between the top 10% and the rest of the people. So to answer your question, I think it depends what you mean by a middle class. And so if you mean it purely in a relative sense, then I suppose it's almost a tautology to say if the government comes in and levies 90% plus income tax rates on incomes above a certain threshold, and then gives, subsidies to people who make less than that, that the resulting distribution of income is going to be more compressed than it would have been, under laissez-faire. And so if you want to say, so there's more, that's more centered around the middle than otherwise, I guess. But if what you mean is the kind of living that, we associate with a robust middle class, no, I would say that the way you do that is you get the government out of the way. That people who are considered poor of this generation, the way you make it so their kids are middle class next generation is you get rid of government barrier, like, tax rates, but also crazy regulations. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff like occupational licensing. I mean, ludicrous things. Like somebody wants to go into, doing African hair braiding, and you need to go get a license, or otherwise the government shuts you down. You got to go to school for 6 months or a year to get trained how to do that, even if, you learned it from your older sister or something, and you know how to do it perfectly well, and you have a clientele who's happy to pay you to do that. No, I mean, there are real cases in the U.S. of the authorities coming in and shutting such people down, and so the very people that Krugman ostensibly wants to help here, the government shutting them down, through the guise of regulating business and ensuring quality for the consumer. So I entirely disagree that the absolute standard of living is higher in Krugman's world than it would be under pure laissez-faire, but it is possible. I mean, things like, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and, these classic examples we point to, these entrepreneurs who form new companies to entirely new product lines or services that people hadn't dreamed of, and they become billionaires. Yeah, you want a system that allows that kind of a person to do that. So it's true, oh, gee, now, there's a billionaire and he has a lot more money than the middle class, but now everybody in the middle class, has the internet, or they have Walmart or whatever, you know what I mean? So to me, if what we're concerned about is the actual standard of living of as many people as possible, particularly the most vulnerable, then yeah, you don't want to have a powerful state. You want to have laissez-faire.
Yeah, and I can definitely see how larger companies are able to deal with the costs of higher taxes, of higher regulations. When you increase the barriers to entry, only the wealthier companies have the the lawyers and the resources to do these things. So it sort of cuts off their competition, and that could definitely be a source of inequality. The fact that it's so much harder to compete with people that are wealthier. He also doesn't say or explain why liberals are really worried about wealth inequality that has been voluntarily accumulated, but they're so okay with a majority of 535 congressmen coercively controlling 330 Americans. How is that not unequal? The fact that he can't see that, I mean, come on, man.
Yeah, and that's, he has a recent column where he's talking about, he's mocking the Cato Institute had a economic index of the 50 states, and Krugman's point was, there's a lot more to life than just freedom from big government. But again, if you have a boss that you don't like, that could be bad, and there's a sense in which your boss has power over you. But ultimately, the worst thing the boss can do is fire you, right? You can always quit. Whereas if the NSA is spying on you, or the CIA comes in and does a secret rendition program or something, I mean, it's a lot harder. If you'd much rather be dealing with a jerk boss than the CIA or the IRS coming after you. So it is amazing that Krugman thinks he's going to help the disadvantaged by turning into an institution. And then with the same breath, he then talks about how the Republicans, who control the state half the time, are these evil monsters. And it's like, okay, well, is your plan then that Republicans will never win another election? And if not, then why would you want to, make the machinery of the state that much more powerful and give them control of healthcare when Donald Trump can win the White House, according to you, Krugman, and he's like the next Hitler. So it really is amazing. I think it's partly just a lust for power that Krugman wants to live in a world where the state is that much powerful. I mean, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but like when he was writing about the so-called $1 trillion platinum coin, the only way I could really make sense of that was just the idea that there could be people with the power to create $1 trillion coin just excited him, and he just wanted to go ahead and run with that.
Yeah, he then quickly references the robber barons. A great book on this is The Myth of the Robber Barons by Bert Folsom. Any quick ideas or things that are important about the so-called robber barons of the 18th century or 1800s?
Yeah. So, you're right. Bert Folsom's book is phenomenal. I quote a little bit of that in my Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, if people want to get that one also. So, just on the face of it, we have these stories of, guys like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Charles Schwab and what, these steel magnates and whatever, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, were just, they were cutthroat competition and but how did they get to be so powerful? Why was it that they could afford to, bargain hard and get like the railroads to give them good deals on shipping? It's because they were so efficient. They cut costs. The reason they got such big market share was that they delivered a better product at lower prices than anybody else had. And that's why people bought their kerosene or whatever. And so, that's how things worked. Now, ironically, that to me, the reason some of those guys, I don't have a high place in my heart for them is because then they use their wealth to go ahead and start funding, interventionist things. Whether it's just to restore their legacy, or some people will be more sinister and say, they wanted, once their family was on top, then they wanted to keep everybody else down. So that's why they supported progressive causes. Going back to what you were saying 10 minutes ago, like people don't realize it's possible if you're a billionaire, you might want to have a high income tax because that makes it harder for competitors to compete against you. You already got your wealth. And so, but like somebody who's going to start a new company and work 90 hours a week and, build it over 10 years to compete with your big company, it's hard to do that if there's a 90% top income tax rate. It's hard for that person to save and accumulate. So anyway, things like that. But yeah, in terms of what the robber barons did, the way they got big, assuming it was in the market, right? There were, and Folsom gets into this in his book, there were some people that went to the state to get special monopoly privileges or subsidies. But those who made their money in the market, yeah, they might have been jerks in their personal life, but the way they in business got ahead was they gave a better product at lower prices.
If you are, say, let's say John D. Rockefeller was immoral, you still in the market have to produce something of value. But between market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs, John D. Rockefeller I thought was very beneficial to society. David Rockefeller I thought was horrendous with his infiltrating the CFR and the Trilateral Commission and everything like that. So that really goes to show you, even if you're a bad person, to become powerful and wealthy in the marketplace, you have to create something that the masses really enjoy. Whereas a powerful person, once they get hold of the state and they're immoral, well, that's when you get the Kissingers, the Ho Chi Minhs, the Maos, the Hitlers, and everyone. So if we do have these bad people, that doesn't justify a state at all. And if you're so worried about the inequality, or it's weird that he only cares about dollar amount inequality when one group of people has a monopoly on initiating violence. Also, he gets so many more readers than, say, you or I, or his TV appearances get so many more viewers. You and I value that. Shouldn't there be a redistribution scheme for those? The fact that he only applies this to the state and to money really shows you that it's not really a conscience that the liberal has. I think it's more of a lust for power, as you were saying earlier.
Right, I agree. And other people have done like reductio ad absurdums. I think there's plenty areas of life where there's inequities, and yet most people, thank goodness, shy away from trying to apply the logic of redistribution in those other areas, right? And so, and again, I'm glad they do that, like, because I wouldn't want them to be consistent and apply those, the horrible idea of forcing people to redistribute in these other areas of life. But yeah, you're right that it's odd that it's only applied in certain areas, and conveniently, it's always in areas where it gives the state more power.
He goes on in chapter 2 to talk about the origins of the welfare state, which I originally learned from Tom Palmer in his book, After the Welfare State. But he says on page 33, as early as 1881, Bismarck described the rationale for what we would now call a welfare state, which he saw as a way to pacify the lower classes and secure the Kaiser's rule. I think this is what LBJ said when he's quoted in the book Inside the White House, saying, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat the next 200 years, that when people ultimately see the illegitimacy of political authority and coercion, even if they see it, if they're dependent on it, they're much less likely to see it in the first place, and they're much less likely to say, you know what, we need to resist this thing. So I thought that was interesting that he mentioned the origins of the welfare state being totally rather conspiratorial, and it's the same welfare state he promotes today.
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that passage. I had marked it up in my copy as well, that it was amazing to me that Krugman didn't at least acknowledge and say something, because he could have covered himself. He could have said something like, of course, I think that Franklin Roosevelt did the same, his policies for noble reasons. And, from our vantage point today, these are good programs, and I support them, and they're good for the social welfare, even though Bismarck may have had ulterior motives in mind. He could have said something like that, but he didn't even, so I don't know. Did it not even occur to him, or did he think, well, I don't want to mislead, I might lose some readers if I mention that. Let me just be quiet about that. I honestly don't know. But yeah, it was amazing to me that he so casually mentioned how the welfare state's origins were clearly designed not to help the recipients, but to keep them down, to keep them subservient to the state. And Krugman just, anyway.
So he then says that the Great Depression made the New Deal possible, which is interesting that he says that in sort of a light-hearted way. And it's very Rahm Emanuel of, never let a crisis go to waste. How that this was a justification for intervention, which, if the victors write the history books, we'll just say was good and brought us out of the Great Depression. He then goes on again to say Hoover was an economic laissez-faire guy. Meanwhile, the Great Myths of the Great Depression by Leonard Read goes into this very deeply. Hoover, you can look at the statistics of government spending increasing, regulations increasing, the Smoot-Hawley tariff being implemented. There's literally documented evidence of this not existing. It's not like, well, I think this had this effect versus, a negative one. You can objectively see Herbert Hoover intervened. How did the Great Depression, I know this is a big question, but briefly, what got America out of the Great Depression. And how is this Hoover myth still around?
Okay, yeah. So great points, and you're right. This isn't a matter of interpretation. I mean, the standard things people say about Hoover. And what's really annoying is Krugman does it a little bit, but I saw something. I think it was by Christina Romer, during like 2009, 2010, was even more shocking, where they choose their words very carefully to say something that's not technically false, but is extremely misleading, right? And so Krugman, for example, in the post-crisis era, had like a New York Times op-ed called "Return of the 50 Herbert Hoovers," and he was talking about all the Republican governors who were slashing spending, and he was pointing out how Hoover wanted to tighten in 1932, not mentioning how he had run big deficits earlier, and that the main tightening was by raising tax rates, ridiculous amounts across the board. That was the main way that Hoover was going to tighten up. Okay, so he didn't mention that. And the casual reader would have thought that Herbert Hoover was just tight-fisted from 1929 onwards, which is not true. The one I had in mind, just so your listeners know what I mean, is Christina Romer said, this isn't an exact quote, but she said something like, once FDR came in, the Depression eased somewhat and unemployment began to come down with his big deficit spending, whereas balanced budgets had been the norm before his taking office. So, yeah, balanced budgets had been the norm before FDR, but not when Hoover was in office, literally right before. Hoover had been running unprecedented peacetime deficits, right? So, again, it's not a technically false statement, but yet it would lead the reader to believe that Herbert Hoover was running balanced budgets when no, he wasn't. So, anyway, so yeah, Hoover. I mean, there was the Hoover Dam, right? That's showing you he wasn't afraid for public works. But incidentally, I think they named it that later on. But the point being that, yes, there were massive expansions of public works projects. One of FDR's lieutenants or something, people running the New Deal later on in the late 30s, admitted, saying something like, we never would have said this during the campaign in 32, of course, but actually the New Deal was really just a logical expansion of all the things that Hoover had done in his administration. In Hoover's memoirs, you kind of feel bad for the guy. And this is another thing where it's completely dishonest. Hoover quotes from his Treasury Secretary, Mellon, who had advocated liquidationism. That Mellon said, after the stock market crash in 29, that Mellon said, sir, let's just let everything drop and we'll find a natural bottom and then the economy will come back. And so Hoover quotes that in his own, autobiography. And then Hoover, writing, goes on to say, but I rejected this advice. And instead, I did more than any president in history before me to try to fight the downturn. And yet people like Brad DeLong and Krugman, not so much, will cite that and say, see, look at what Hoover's Treasury Secretary told them, leading people to believe that Hoover followed the advice, not that Hoover flatly said, no, we're not doing that. So you're right. This claim, this idea that Hoover was a laissez-faire guy's crazy. The other thing, just for people who haven't thought of it this way, what are we trying to explain, right? We're trying to explain why is it that on Herbert Hoover's watch, all of a sudden, this economic downturn turned into the worst thing ever in U.S. history. It wouldn't make sense to say Herbert Hoover was afraid to intervene because all his predecessors didn't intervene either, right? It's not like there was the SEC and welfare, food stamps and Social Security in 1925, and then Hoover gets elected and dismantles all that. No, that stuff didn't exist beforehand. So why was it that on Hoover's watch it turned into the Great Depression and not under anybody else's watch previously? What does make more sense is to say Hoover was the most interventionist at that time, and we were still on the gold standard, and there was other factors at play, and then that's why you had this recipe. So specifically, what happened was the stock market crashes, prices start falling. There were runs on the banks, and in previous depressions, prices would fall and wage rates would fall. So the labor market would clear after 18 months or whatever. Hoover calls in all the business leaders and says, "Don't cut wage rates. I don't want the workers to have to bear the brunt of this downturn." And that was the critical mistake. So now wage rates are staying, are much stickier, not because the market's sticky, but because Hoover, with government prodding, told business to do that. And so prices in general are falling. Workers have to keep getting paid the same, dollars per hour. What do you think is going to happen? Of course, businesses don't want to hire as many workers. So that's why unemployment went up so high. So I guess you asked me what actually solved it. I think really what it was is finally after World War II, the government just pulled back. Okay. And also Bob Higgs points out going into the war, this is the one sense in which the World War II partially was responsible, is FDR, his administration had been very anti-business. Like he was proudly saying in his acceptance speeches at the convention, things like, the rich elite, they look at me with scorn and I wear their scorn as a badge of honor. I'm paraphrasing, but Roosevelt was openly declaring his hostility to the rich. Like he was engaging in class warfare. And so, business owners and stuff, they really didn't know. And the New Deal was crazy in terms of violating property rights, the traditional American understanding of property rights and the role of government. And so big business, they didn't want to invest. And then, with Pearl Harbor and everything, the Roosevelt administration realized, okay, we need companies to be cranking out tanks and planes. We can't be demonizing big business right now because we got a war to fight. And so that's kind of how like the Roosevelt administration made its peace, at least with business owners, and got them on board. And then, after the war, like I say, when they cut taxes and cut spending and everything, that's what I think ultimately led to the full recovery.
And it's so funny, you see the intentional misleading so often, like when Obama or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders says, women get paid 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes. You don't actually believe that, or else obviously the businesses would only hire women to put their competitors out of business. That the gender wage gap myth to me is just so unbelievable that they're getting away with that. It's almost as bad as the Hoover economic isolationist sort of theory.
Yeah, you're right. And it's for your viewers who haven't seen those demonstrations, I mean the way to get the really bad, shocking statistic, it's amazing how little they account for. So, and the crudest versions of those statistics, where they just look and see like how many total dollars were women paid in wages or salaries, and how many men, and then you just divide, and how many, and it's so the fact that men work more on average than women, that's one of the reasons. Okay, now some of them are more careful and they will adjust for things like that. Like they'll say, okay, of all full-time employed men and women, and they'll do that. But even there, some of those statistics, they don't account for the fact that men, even if they're full-time employees, still on average work more hours per week. They don't, those figures, So one way of looking is when you start adjusting for these things, I say, okay, like, once you adjust for how many hours per week, once you adjust for what's the highest degree they obtained, right? Because for whatever reason, you can say it's because of sexism or cultural attitudes. Okay, fine. But the fact is, like, more men have PhDs in physics and chemistry and math than women do. Okay. And so there's things like that when you adjust for the danger of the job, right? More men are coal miners, and that's a more dangerous occupation than being a librarian. And so in equilibrium, in order to get people to do the dangerous jobs, they get paid more. Or, that's one of the ways to attract people into those fields, to compensate for the higher risk of injury or death. Right. So once you adjust for those, it's not that the wage gap entirely disappears, but it almost does when you start making these common sense things. And another huge one is, women leave the workforce to have kids. So you can blame biology, so that's not fair. And, I guess it's not in a sense, but given that happens and you're a firm and you got one guy who's been in the workforce for 10 years and a woman who was there for 4 and then took 2 years off and now is back, who's going to be more experienced? Who's going to have more skills? Who's going to be more productive? So you're right. Once you adjust for those things. And the last point, as you mentioned, it's, the people who say that with a straight face, it's amazing. Is that, okay, so you really think there's, 1,000 women you could hire and pay them 77% or whatever the number is and get the same output as 1,000 men that you'd have to pay them, that much, 1,000 for. So why don't you do that and lower your labor costs by whatever, 25%? Like there's not a single entrepreneur who had this idea. Even a woman, there's women who own businesses. How come Oprah's not just hiring women if they're that cheap? So you're right. The whole logic just shows how little people understand how market economies work.
Yeah. And it's like saying older people get paid more than younger people. Yeah, they have different jobs and work longer hours. Asians make more money than whites, and Jews make more money than whites. Yeah, different positions, different different hours, lot of different things, not just sexism, racism, white supremacy. According to econlib.org, federal spending in 1929 was $3 billion. By the time Hoover left office in 32, 33, federal spending was at $6 billion. The budget can't double, and you tell me he was an isolationist. That was my final point on that. In chapter 3, Krugman goes into, he says, there's a natural cycle of inequality driven by market forces. The rich were rich because of returns on capital they owned. Unions in the 1940s to the 1970s experienced the golden age of manual labor, and growth can exist with high taxes. The evidence of this is from the FDR administration. The big thing in that, do unions cause prosperity?
For sure, I would say no, not in the U.S. context. So let me mention this. It's typical in like the free market tradition for people to be real hostile to unions, and that's because historically, and Krugman gets it in this book, using euphemisms, saying things like, there's strikes or whatever and boycotts, and he's kind of glossing over the fact that the way a union would enforce a strike against like a factory is they would surround it and have a picket line, and then if a so-called scab tried to come in, they would beat the crap out of the person. Okay, and so when they had to have the police come in and break up a strike or a sit-in, Krugman's looking at that like, oh, big business in the state cracking heads against. But I was like, well, if it's private property and and the employer says, okay, you don't want to work here on these conditions, leave. There's other people out there who would be willing to. If they have to bring the police in to get involved to escort the union members off the premises, that's because they were violating private property. So again, I'm sure the police did, used excessive force, and they should, but ultimately in a situation like that, the issue is that, the way the union works is that they intimidate potential competition from other workers who are not part of the union, and that's the way they get the employer to bend to their will. So that's why historically free market economists have tended to be skeptical of unions and may have just casually said things, like, oh yeah, unions raise wages, but the expense of non-union members and blah, blah, blah. But in a free society, there is a role for collective bargaining. And so, you could imagine like the plumbers all being part of something. They might even call it a guild or something, if it's all voluntary. There could be associations of people just represented, or like a big factory and there's thousands of employees and they have different grievances or different desires, like, hey, we want air conditioning or we want a lunch room and we're willing to take a pay cut just to reduce negotiating costs. You might have representation or something, but again, that would all be voluntary. So I'm not saying in a laissez-faire world there wouldn't be unions, but I am saying for Krugman to think that in the 20th century in the United States, it was, the role of unions has been benign, I think is demonstrably false. That they're the ones that had to rely on coercion in order to help their members. And, that might work for the people who are in the union, but then necessarily that restricts efficiency and it hurts the workers who are not in the union.
Yeah, and whenever he brings up a problem, bad conditions, or he'll bring up inequality, he never justifies violence, which is what you need to justify if you're going to justify state intervention. That's the whole thing. So the fact that he just says this was a problem, government intervention is therefore necessary, he never even justifies it on the fundamental claims. He does mention in chapter 4, he says Republicans in the Cold War were torn between anti-communism and traditional isolationism, which reminded me of the fact that Ron Paul got more military donations than all his other Republican opponents combined. That just hit me and I wanted to mention that again. But in chapter 5, he goes on to talk about LBJ and the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm kidding, of course, he doesn't mention the Gulf of Tonkin. He talks about LBJ, the Great Society, Medicare and Medicaid. Was LBJ's Great Society a positive influence in middle class standard of living?
No, not at all. And here, I mean, this is just demonstrably false. For example, if you look at a chart, so suppose somebody wanted to make the case that the so-called war on poverty was good, there's a couple ways you do it. One thing is you could just look at, the recipients of food stamps and other sorts of assistance right now, and then say, well, gee, if we stop giving them that money, look at what their, pre-transfer income would be and look how poor they would be, right? So that's one way you would just do it. So look at all these people getting these handouts, and so what would they do without it? Okay. Another thing you could do is you could look at like the rate of poverty, and that does, depending on what time period, you could show that, oh yeah, see, poverty has come down a little bit, since LBJ's war on poverty began. Okay, the problem with that second one, that's the easiest one to tackle, is if you pull back the camera and look at a longer stretch of history, the poverty rate was dropping before the federal government rolled up its sleeves to fight poverty, right? In market economies, the standard of living goes up over time, right? Per capita income goes up. We see that all over the world, like Hong Kong or whatever. I mean, they're so much richer now than they were in 1950, right? So things get richer, people get richer over time, particularly the more you have property rights and laissez-faire. And so in the U.S., in the 1940s and 50s, especially right after World War II, like I say, when the government was scaling back, you had the poverty rate was falling rapidly, and then the rate that it fell slowed once the war on poverty began. Okay, so it's true that a poor person in 1980 is better than a poor person in 66 or something, but I think you could make a plausible case that the poor person in 1980 under the welfare state is poorer than he would have been in 1980 under laissez-faire. But we don't know, because that alternate universe never happened. So and then as far as the recipient stuff, I mean, like, for example, people could say, look at the people who are getting Social Security, retirement benefit checks, and look at how much they have in their private savings and whatever. They would be devastated if we just turned off these Social Security payments. And that's true for a lot of recipients, but that's because during their whole working careers, they were, number one, told you're going to have these payments coming in once you turn 65, so they planned accordingly. And two, even if they wanted to save a lot, they couldn't, because the government was taking so much out of their paycheck in FICA payroll contributions, right? And so, it's, again, the government doesn't have resources of its own. The only thing the government can give to you is what it's taken away, and at best there can be some redistribution, but especially the longer the time frame, there's less pie to go around if the government is taxing and regulating.
Yeah, Hans Hermann Hoppe, in A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, talks about the best socialist capitalist experiment was Germany being split up after the Second World War. Or chapter 6, where he talks about Milton Friedman, the Chicago school versus the Keynesian school. The left has like thousands of ideas on how to violently redistribute wealth, but the fact that they don't focus on wealth creation and being the foundation of society, the fact that they never talk about how it's created in the first place, why some countries are wealthier than others, makes me question the sincerity behind their claims. So the question is, what makes some countries wealthy and some countries poor in the Austrian view?
Well, I'm sure any particular Austrian might have different emphases, but I mean the main thing is rule of law, respect for property rights, and I suppose nowadays people might stress more with the work of Deidre McCloskey, let's say the culture, and I don't mean anything I don't mean like in terms of culture wars or something in the U.S. context. I just mean like in some societies historically, they may have had a very efficient, non-corrupt administrative state that, sort of neutrally enforced property title transfers. But if that society, looked down with disdain on merchants as like dirty, dabblers in commerce, and like no respectable family would want their son to grow up to be a shopkeeper, but would want their son to go into government service, and that was the noble thing. You could see how that kind of a place would not be as commercially successful and have as rapid economic growth as some other place where they really, championed the entrepreneur. So the crucial thing to me, as I say, is respect for property rights. We might call economic freedom, limited government. They can't debase the currency. They can't just arbitrarily take your wealth, rule of law, things like that. And then on top of that, if you want to really get icing on the cake, if the culture is generally supportive of voluntary commercial relations, that's the kind of society that's going to grow rich. Ultimately, in terms of the mechanics of it, Mises always stressed that it's the investments capital per worker, right? The reason U.S. workers right now can produce so much per year, I mean, partly it's their education, but as we were mentioning earlier, the U.S. education system is not too great. Really, what it is that they're working with more tools and equipment than people like in Bangladesh. Or the reason that American workers in 2018 are so much more productive than American workers in 1918 were, is because today they're working with so much more, tools and equipment that augments the productivity of their bare hands. So that's why we can produce so much, and that's why we can consume so much.
Yeah, I really realized that one day our computers software went down, and instead of doing like 100 orders that my work does in a day, I think we did like 5 or 6. We were so much less productive because of the capital investment in equipment. So each one of us, we're doing everything by hand. So that really showed me, like in real world terms, wow, this is why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. Chapter 7 is on movement conservatism. It's all mind reading. Here's Bill Buckley said this thing. Bill Kristol said this thing. These people also support conservatism. Therefore, it's illegitimate. So I don't even want to get into that.
Can I mention, though, what I was interested, there were some shocking quotes from, I think one of them was from Bill Buckley and another one was from National Review. I don't know that Buckley wrote it, but it was like from an editorial from National Review, like back in the 50s. And it was pretty like, yikes. And so I just thought that was funny because, as you know, I'm sure, National Review like anointed itself as the policeman of the right and, like expelled the John Birch people or whatever, these crazy nut job conspiracy theory. And so I thought it was kind of odd that, wait a minute, these guys said some pretty, politically incorrect stuff back in the day too. And so now they're the ones walking around keeping the right clean. Give me a break. So.
And it turned out in the 90s, as Tom Woods mentions in his book, the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, the Venona papers actually it showed evidence that the Birch Society was right about communist infiltration and the Rosenbergs and everything else. So, yeah, National Review, I think, is nonsense, and I agree with Rothbard on condemning them. On Chapter 8, he mentions that Reagan had this dumb belief that if you lower taxes, you'd get more money. But the Laffer curve actually shows that that is possible. He talks about the top 10% paid 96% of all taxes at one point in American history. Now, it's important to cite the work of Thomas Sowell, where he says, under Calvin Coolidge, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush Jr., taxes were lowered, and it led to increased revenues. So Krugman is just objectively wrong on that. The question in this chapter is redistribution necessary to keep capitalism afloat? In other words, if owners of cap just keep reaping money, will that not suck the workers dry?
No, on the contrary. I mean, I guess if you want to clarify, but no, I mean, again, what makes wages rise is to have the workers' productivity go up, and other things equal, the more capital per worker, the higher the wage rate will be. Okay, so if you have a bunch of workers in society, what you want is for the rich people to be saving and reinvesting most of their income so that their capital stock grows. Because then, I mean, just think about it in crude terms, forget money, just imagine everything's barter, and you're like some landlord and you own all the farmland and you have a bunch of tractors and, and then there's a bunch of just, poor peasants out there with their bare hands. In terms of just, how much is it worth it to you? If you're the landlord and you're going to say to people, okay, well, I guess you have to have two landlords, right? So they're competing with each other for workers. So under competition, what are you going to be willing to pay a worker? Well, the most you're going to pay him is, well, how much extra, does the harvest go up if I let this guy work for me? So if you think about it, if you just had no tractors and they were all just coming and using their bare hands to get cropped, it wouldn't be very much. But if you had hundreds and hundreds of tractors with no workers, and now workers were lined up outside and you were bidding on them, well, now you could see, yeah, if I get one more worker who can jump in this tractor, the output, the yield goes way up, right? And so, again, that's just showing, and also, too, ultimately, how are workers supposed to eat? That food needs to be produced. So it's the way you augment output is you have more capital per worker. Okay, and so yes, it is true. If there's like 5 guys and they own all the capital and they keep reinvesting it, the absolute difference, the gap between them and the workers might grow bigger, and they might be quadrillionaires. But you got to ask yourself, what do we want? Do we want the workers to have the highest standard of living, or do we want them to just not feel jealous of some guy who has more than them? And so if what you want is to make them in absolute terms as best off as possible, you want the capitalists, growing their fortune and having more tools and equipment for the workers to work with.
And just generally, you want a free populace, because when people are more free, they make more voluntary, mutually beneficial exchanges, and that will lead to greater societal wealth. Maybe they don't want money, they value leisure time more than more working hours or different conditions. So the fact that Krugman sees himself as this virtuous central planner, that he really knows how to coercively control the economy, tells me there's not too much to the conscience of the liberal here.
Right, yeah. It's also, too, I mean, what's funny is recently, I mentioned earlier, in this episode here, this discussion, Krugman was mocking the Cato Institute because they, rank the U.S. states by freedom, and Krugman was saying stuff like, "Oh, New York State's the lowest in their ranking, and I'm here in New York. I guess I'm in a socialist hellhole, ha ha." And then literally the next day, he had a column titled "It Can Happen Here," and he was pointing to, authoritarian crackdowns on the free press or whatever in Poland and Hungary, and was warning his readers, yeah, look at what Republicans have done at the state level here. Okay, so Krugman, without batting an eye, mocks people who are worried about socialism to say, no, really what's happening is we're getting fascism, right? And so I guess my point is that the liberal, the leftists are supposed to understand the dangers of power. They're supposed to question authority. They're supposed to realize Big Brother is watching you. And so, Orwell was a leftist, but he understood the danger of totalitarians. Whereas Krugman, just seems to think, no, as long as someone's going to promise you universal health care. And like you said earlier, Krugman knows full well that the welfare state was born in the mind of someone who was using it cynically to keep the population subjected. And so it's amazing to me that Krugman doesn't even, pay lip service to the idea that, well, I could see why maybe you wouldn't want your kidney transplant to be dependent on some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. No, he just dismisses that as Sarah Palin's this crazy nut job who believes in death panels.
Okay, death panels actually are part of Obamacare. It's called the Independent Payment Advisory Board, or IPAB. So she was actually right about that, but forget about that. He never apologizes when he's wrong. Chapter 11 is the crux of, I'm sorry.
One quick thing, let me just mention, I don't know if you've seen or your listeners, when you get a chance, go to YouTube and Google Paul Krugman death panel sales tax, and you'll see Krugman was speaking to a live audience, and he said, so how do we solve the entitlement problem? Well, we raise taxes, and then we have the government approve only medically necessary procedures. So basically, tax hikes and death panels. Ha. And then he was like, oh, I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. So yeah, he was making a joke, but the joke was what the kind of thing Sarah Palin was warning about. Maybe not the specifics, but the spirit of, do you want the government in charge of whether you live or die? He was saying, yes, I want the government in charge of whether these procedures are going to get funded.
And that actually did happen in the VA scandal. That is an article on CNN. I think they cite 300,000 deaths as a causal result of VA inefficiency. So chapter 11 is the crux of the book, because in the opening he says, what liberals need to focus on, if there's one thing we can get, it's universal health care. The things stopping us are movement conservatism and racist whites. In chapter 11, he names a number of things. I'm just going to list these off, and then I'm going to ask you a question about them. Healthcare, U.S. Is unique among wealthy nations that it does not guarantee healthcare to all its citizens. 15% are uninsured. The World Health Organization ranks France #1 and the U.S. 37th. Oh, heavens, they don't approve of us there. Medicare administration costs are about 2%. Private insurance is at 15% in their administration costs. Canada admin costs versus the U.S. are 17% versus U.S. 31%. Private care does not have an incentive to give preventative care to customers, whereas the state would. There are 80 million Americans on Medicare or Medicaid or the VA. Quote, government actually pays more for medical care than private insurance. In 2004, government programs paid for 44%, while private paid for 36%. That was before Medicare Part D and Obamacare. Page 238, he cites Bill Kristol, the anarcho-capitalist Bill Kristol. Like, these people represent small government. Healthcare and welfare state might succeed, and this is bad, because it would make the case for future government intervention. He also smashes the American Medical Association, claiming that they were one of the main opponents since Harry Truman to oppose single payer. So why is Paul Krugman wrong about healthcare?
Okay, so even the other stuff you were reading, it's funny. They're trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, they're saying, look at these other nations that just have the government go ahead and take care of healthcare instead of having to relying on private mechanisms, which clearly don't work. They have all these better outcomes, and then the same breath to say, oh, and by the way, in the U.S., the government's the one that's funding most of the healthcare anyway. And so it's like, okay, so this is not an example of laissez-faire, right? And so it's not clear that all those statistics you pointed to show why laissez-faire in healthcare is not working. By your own admission, the government is heavily involved already in healthcare, even before the Affordable Care Act. So there's that move right there. It is to explain the inefficient. And by the way, for your viewers who don't know, I have a book called The Primal Prescription that I co-authored with an ER medical doctor, Doug McGuff, where we give the history of healthcare in the United States, from an economics perspective and the various government interventions, and then talk about the Affordable Care Act and then what people might be able to do. So again, that's called The Primal Prescription if you want to see more on this. But in a nutshell, it's a classic case. What happened in U.S. healthcare? Why is it that so many people, you just know it's something screwy with health insurance in the United States, right? That's not how your car insurance works, right? You don't go and get an oil change and it doesn't cost $500 and then your car insurance pays for most of it and you just pay, you know what I'm saying? Like regular things like that, you just pay out of pocket and you have car insurance there in case there's a disaster. And that's not what health insurance has become. So that's a large part of what's going on. And you have these third-party payments, like whether it's the government through Medicare, Medicaid, or if it's private insurance companies. And so the patient is no longer the customer. The patient's like this annoying thing that gets in everybody's way. And really the hospital's working for either the insurance company or for the government. Yet the hospital, the doctor's not working for you because you're paying 5% of the bill as the private person. So that's really the fundamental problem there. And these other places, I'll just say two more points on it because it's obviously a big topic. Some of these comparisons, like showing life expectancy, in the U.S. versus other places and how much we spend on healthcare, blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit misleading because a lot of that's driven by gun violence. Okay, so you could say, well, that's not a pat on the back for the U.S. if we have more gun homicides. But on the other hand, that's not showing that a relatively freer market in healthcare doesn't work because people are dying from gunshot wounds that don't, It's not that in France they can magically cure gunshot wounds. It's just the incidence is lower, right? So there's that element. When you take out gun fatalities, then all of a sudden the U.S. does a lot better on some of those international rankings in terms of life expectancy. And the other thing too is people know just anecdotally. I mean, there's lots of things like number of MRIs per person, number of specialists, or the wait time to go see a specialist in the U.S., say, versus Canada. Like if you got to get a hip replacement, a lot of people in Canada just come to the U.S. to do it because they know it'll just never happen if they wait around in Canada. So there's lots of things like that to show. I think one way of putting it is the problems with some of these other countries. There's like an escape valve that people can, people. In other words, the Canadian system doesn't strike Canadians as so bad because they can leave and come to the U.S. if they have some problem they really just want to write a check for and take care of. Whereas if the U.S. goes down that path, then the Canadian, there's nowhere to go. So there's that element. Same thing too with these, really expensive drugs that are developed, these pharmaceuticals. Well, the main reason they're so expensive is because of patent protection and the FDA, right? That right now, major drug companies have to spend billion with a B dollars to bring a new drug to market because they have to, do all these clinical trials and blah, 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 and so that explains why they only mass market drugs to, certain Viagra and stuff like that, or they're not going to do some real niche product because they need to make that money, but they need to make more than $1 billion in revenue to cover their cost, right? And so there's elements like that too to explain some of the just absurdities in the U.S. healthcare market.
I would sort of summarize the conscience of a libertarian in the way that there's two ways to achieve your ends: the way of voluntarism or the way of violence, force versus persuasion. Krugman summarizes the conscience of a liberal in a number of sentences. He says, liberalism, in other words, isn't just about the welfare state. It's also about democracy and the rule of law. Liberals are always trying to enfranchise citizens, while conservatives are always trying to block some citizens from voting. I believe a relatively equal society supported by institutions that limit extremes of wealth and poverty. I believe in democracy, civil liberties, and rule of law. That makes me a liberal, and I'm proud of it. Liberals are those who believe in institutions that limit inequality and injustice. My question to you is, does supporting social programs, a social safety net, universal health care, regulation, redistribution, etc., give leftists the moral high ground?
Well, it does in conventional conversations, but it shouldn't, right? So yes, the way people talk, you're having a discussion about healthcare, and libertarian types are always bending over backwards and they're real apologetic and red in the face and we care about people. It's just that maybe there's inefficiencies and whereas the other, I just want to help people and and it's sort of shocking how it's like, well, the good person in the conversation, the noble person, the high-minded one, is the one who wants to just take money at gunpoint from some other people to pay for a program that this person supports. And he's the good guy, and the people who are saying, well, no, I'm not sure why I should have to pay for that, or make a case and maybe I'll donate voluntarily, but why are you just taking my money against my will? And that person's the jerk. So yeah, it is amazing to me that, again, look at this in this throughout this book where Krugman doesn't even, I didn't devote a single sentence to diffusing the possible objection that, well, maybe we need a good reason to take away. It was more like redistributing. And by the way, Thomas Piketty does this literally. Thomas Piketty, in his book on Capital in the 21st Century, that best-selling book, he doesn't even pretend to say we need to have 90% plus income tax rates on the rich people in order to fund welfare programs. He just says, no, the point of having these high tax rates in place is so that the companies don't bother paying their CEO a really high salary, because what's the point? It'll just get taxed away. So he admits full well the point of these high tax rates is not to raise revenue. It is just to make sure we don't live in a world where some people are really rich. So to me, that's horrifying. I can't believe that people hate the rich so much that doesn't even have to be justified. That people just accept that oh yeah, go ahead and just make it illegal to earn a bunch of money because we don't want to have a bunch of rich people walking around. So to answer your question, yeah, I think the way common discourse happens, there's a presumption that somebody who wants to use the state's coercion to do something that they claim is going to help people, that they have the moral high ground, and any critic, is walking on eggshells and trying to say, no, it's, I really have a good heart, but you would think the person who's trying to justify coercion would have the, have the burden of proof.
So what I often ask the progressive friends of mine is, so why does the state get to have a monopoly on initiating violence? Is this something anyone can do? Why? What is so special about this group, government? Are they so much smarter, so much more moral? What is the justification for this? And their inability to explain why that violence either isn't violence or is justified, I think is where they really fail the test of claiming to have the conscience that overrides the rest of us. I do think there is this hatred, this sort of Iago envy that they hate the rich so much, even if it doesn't help anyone else, they just want them poor. This sort of Pol Pot killing fields idea that at any means necessary, we have to make things more equal. And a book I meant to bring up for healthcare is Death by Regulation by Mary Ruwart. That was a terrific book that I came across. Mr. Murphy, any final thoughts on the book? We have a couple minutes left.
I guess one big thing that Krugman didn't mention, so a big part of his story is how, you know, we've returned to what he calls the Gilded Age, right? That inequality used to be real big. Then there was the Great Depression, the New Deal, you know, the high tax rates of the 50s and 60s. And then things started turning around and, you know, inequality started rising again. And, you know, you would get the impression, since he laid so much emphasis on the tax rates of FDR and whatever, and even Dwight Eisenhower and LBJ and what have you, you would think that it was in the Reagan years when everything turned around. But if you look at the standard statistics and even some of the stuff Krugman gives out, the turnaround happened in the early 70s, right? If you've seen some of these statistics saying, oh, median household income has stagnated, blah, blah, blah. Where they start those figures to show you how bad it is in the early 70s. And so I want to say, you know what happened in the early 70s is Richard Nixon went off the gold standard. So to the extent that you want to blame something for fundamentally changing the way, you know, economic growth gets distributed among different members of society, if that's the way you want to look at it, to me, a big thing, you know, it's not so much the war on poverty or tax rates, it's the fact that the Fed was able to start creating money, you know, at will in the early 70s. And so who do you think would benefit from a system like that? You know, it's not the salaried person who, you know, goes to a factory and punches a time clock each day. It's the speculators, the people, you know, the wheeler dealers on Wall Street or defense contractors, people like that. Those are the people that you would expect to do relatively better in a system like that. And the data seem to support that.
Yeah. And again, the fact that he never addresses the difference between government and a group of regular people, the fact that they initiate violence to achieve their ends, I feel like the book totally fails on that grounds, because without that, there is no justification for a state, or especially an interventionist state.
Right, exactly. So yes, there's the two-pronged, you know, my objection to Krugman's public works is that is a two-pronged one, that, you know, the morality of it. So it's ironic that he says, you know, he calls this stuff the conscience of a liberal, but also just the economics of it. So I think he's wrong on both counts. That, in other words, even if it were true, just neutrally scientifically, that, oh yeah, the government doing all these interventions and taking money from this person and giving it to that person, even if it were true that would like smooth the business cycle, I would still be opposed to it on moral grounds and say you're not allowed to take people's property, even if you're going to do something good with it. But what's particularly perverse is Krugman's advocating measures that I believe are immoral, and they don't even achieve their ostensible purposes.
Terrific. Well, Mr. Murphy, thanks so much for your time. And for the viewers out there who really have a hard time reading Man, Economy, and State or Human Action, Mr. Murphy has actually provided study guides for both of those books, which I have, but I forgot to quote from. So those are two excellent resources. Mr. Murphy, the one question I ask everyone who I admire very much, if you could have everyone in the world read one book that isn't yours, what book would that be? A
lot of them probably already have read it, but I would point them to the Bible. So that's what I would say. Whether you're a believer or not, I just think there's a lot of wisdom in there, and you'll understand the world a lot better by studying that.
Terrific. Mr. Murphy, thanks so much for your time. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Keith.